June 1944, the island of Saipan burns beneath a sun of steel. Palm trees stand split like matchsticks, their leaves hanging in the smoke. The sand, once white, is blackened with ash and blood. The cries of the wounded echo between shattered cliffs. Americans, and somewhere among them, Japanese. An American field medic, his face streaked with grime, crawls through the mud. He passes fallen Marines, calling out for survivors. Then he hears a faint voice, a whisper in Japanese. A wounded enemy soldier lies half-buried, trembling, his uniform torn and face pale with shock. The medic hesitates, then slings his rifle aside and lifts the man over his shoulder. Minutes later, inside a canvas field tent marked with a red cross, surgeons work under lantern light. On one table, a U.S. Marine fights for his life. On the next, a Japanese soldier receives the same care, the same morphine, the same bandages. Outside, captured Japanese officers stare in silence. Their code taught them that mercy was weakness, that the enemy's death brought honor. But here, in the American tents, the impossible is happening. They are saving their enemies. In the vast Pacific, war was not merely a clash of armies, it was a collision of worlds. Between 1942 and 1944, as the United States fought its island-by-island campaign toward Japan, two civilizations met under fire, one built on the sanctity of the individual, the other on the sacrifice of the self. The Imperial Japanese Army fought under the ancient code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It preached loyalty unto death, honor over survival, and viewed capture as the deepest disgrace. Surrender meant spiritual annihilation. To be taken alive was to cease being Japanese. Even medics and nurses were trained to die rather than fall into enemy hands. The Americans, by contrast, carried a very different creed into battle, one rooted in the Geneva Convention of 1929, in medical ethics, and in a cultural belief that every life had value. Even in enemies, the Red Cross was sacred. Field medics, corpsmen, and surgeons were expected to treat any wounded they found, allied or Axis, friend or foe. This clash of codes became painfully visible on the front line. After battles in places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Bougainville, American troops discovered that Japanese wounded often refused treatment, using grenades to kill themselves rather than accept help. Others feigned death until their final breath. To the Americans, it was incomprehensible. To the Japanese, mercy from an enemy was unthinkable. By mid-1944, the United States was winning, island by island, mile by mile. But the moral gulf remained immense. The Pacific Campaign's savagery had few parallels. Jungle rot, heat, disease, and a fanatical enemy that refused to surrender. American soldiers hardened themselves to survive. Yet among the horror, U.S. medics still carried the Red Cross emblem as a promise. Not of victory, but of humanity. The contrast was sharp. In Japanese field hospitals, triage meant conserving resources for those who could fight again. The hopelessly wounded were left behind or given grenades. In American hospitals, the wounded were treated regardless of cause. This difference shocked many Japanese officers captured later in the war, especially when they saw their own soldiers being given blood transfusions and plasma beside American Marines. By 1944, on the island of Saipan, the clash of ethics would reach its most dramatic moment. It was there that Japanese officers would witness something they had never imagined possible: the enemy risking his own life to save theirs. Battle of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, and became one of the bloodiest encounters of the Pacific War. Nearly 71,000 U.S. troops landed on the island against more than 30,000 Japanese defenders. Many dug deep into caves and cliffs. The fighting was merciless. Artillery turned the beaches into firestorms. Civilians, caught between two armies, suffered alongside soldiers. For both nations, Saipan was not just a battlefield, it was a moral crucible. When the smoke began to clear, American field hospitals were overflowing. Surgeons worked day and night, hands trembling from exhaustion, blood soaking through their uniform. They treated Marines with shattered limbs, sailors burned by explosions, and soon Japanese soldiers dragged in from the rubble. Many of those wounded were discovered by Marine medics crawling into caves still echoing with gunfire. For the Americans, saving lives, even enemy lives, was duty. Under the Geneva Convention, once a man was wounded or captured, he ceased to be an enemy. He became a patient. Every U.S. corpsman knew this by heart. In training manuals and field briefings, the rule was simple: aid the wounded. All wounded. The Japanese, however, had no such precedent. The Imperial Army viewed American medics not as humanitarian figures, but as combatants disguised under a false symbol. Some Japanese units even targeted men wearing the Red Cross, believing mercy to be deceit. Yet, when captured Japanese officers were finally brought to American hospitals on Saipan, the sight of what unfolded inside those tents shattered that belief entirely. Rows of American surgeons worked shoulder to shoulder, sweat dripping, instruments sterilized in boiling water, blood plasma hanging from hooks above stretchers. On one table lay an American Marine moaning through morphine. On the next, a Japanese sergeant, chest bandage, receiving the same treatment, same anesthetic, same steady hand. For the Japanese observers, the scene was incomprehensible. In their world, to save an enemy's life was to betray one's nation. Here, it was a matter of principle. Some of the captured officers tried to rationalize what they saw. Perhaps the Americans were using the prisoners for experiments, or saving them to extract information. But when they saw the wounded returned to rest tents, fed and guarded from harm, the truth became undeniable. The Americans were keeping them alive simply because it was right. Reports later recorded the confusion and disbelief of these men. A Japanese medical officer, interrogated after Saipan, admitted, "We thought the Red Cross was a lie. Then we saw our own men treated better than we could have treated them." In the following months, similar stories emerged from Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. American field medics risked sniper fire to drag enemy wounded from caves. Some carried Japanese soldiers who later died in their arms. Others operated side by side with captured Japanese doctors, sharing supplies and training. These acts didn't make the war any less brutal, but they illuminated a fundamental difference between two empires locked in mortal combat. One fought for survival through sacrifice, the other through preservation. For many Japanese soldiers who lived through that contrast, the battlefield became a place not just of defeat, but of revelation. And that revelation, that mercy could exist amid slaughter, would become the heart of this story. The first emotion was disbelief. When Japanese soldiers awoke inside American field tents, they expected humiliation or interrogation, not morphine, bandages, and nurses handing them water. Many had been taught since childhood that surrender was a stain that could never be washed away. Now, lying on cots beside the very men they had tried to kill, they found themselves treated as human beings. American medics did not ask for loyalty or gratitude. They acted out of habit, professionalism, and moral code. One U.S. corpsman later said, "It didn't matter who they were. When a man's bleeding, he's just a man." The Japanese prisoners, by contrast, often turned their faces to the wall, ashamed to live. Some refused food until ordered by their own officers to survive. Yet slowly, the boundaries softened. Wounded Marines offered cigarettes to Japanese soldiers who could barely lift their heads. A captured Japanese nurse, the first many Americans had seen, was handed a clean uniform and invited to assist in caring for both sides' wounded. There was no triumph in these moments, no speeches, no photographs, just quiet gestures of decency amid devastation. For many Japanese officers observing from confinement, this behavior was more destabilizing than defeat itself. The Americans had not only beaten them in combat, they had shown compassion in victory. And to men raised to believe mercy was weakness, that was a shock deeper than any wound. To outsiders, saving enemy soldiers during combat looked reckless, even dangerous. But to the U.S. military, it was an extension of discipline. The Geneva Convention and American field manuals established that medics were non-combatants. Protecting life, even the enemy's, reinforced order and moral superiority, essential tools in maintaining unit cohesion during long, dehumanizing campaigns. Field hospitals were logistical miracles. Within hours of a battle's end, Marine and Army engineers would raise tent cities filled with medical equipment, sterilizers, and makeshift operating theaters. Here, Triage officers determined priority strictly by medical need, not nationality. A dying Japanese soldier might be treated before an American with lighter wound, because to the medics, the rule was sacred: save whoever can be saved first. This discipline had strategic value. It demonstrated to allied nations and to the world that the United States fought differently. American propaganda films quietly used these scenes to reinforce the image of moral contrast, democracy healing where fascism destroyed. Even the enemy noticed. Reports intercepted from Japanese POW camps later revealed astonishment at the efficiency of American medical care and the adherence to international law. To the Imperial Command, such behavior was inconceivable. To the Americans, it was simply what separated civilization from chaos. The tactical order of compassion, paradoxically, made the American war machine even stronger. At the heart of this moral divide was a cultural rift centuries wide. Japan's Bushido code was born from the samurai tradition, a warrior's life defined by loyalty and the purity of death. Under that code, a wounded soldier who could not fight was expected to die with dignity, not be tended like a child. Even Japanese military medicine was designed around this ideal. Resources were conserved for the living, not wasted on the dying. American military medicine, meanwhile, evolved from both science and faith. The U.S. Army Medical Corps, influenced by Christian humanitarian ethics and modern secular medicine, believed that the preservation of life was the highest moral duty. To them, compassion was not sentiment, it was civilization in practice. When these two philosophies collided in the Pacific, the effect was profound. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to despise weakness, now witnessed an enemy who risked his own life to treat theirs. It undermined every story they had been told about the barbarism of the West. One captured Japanese officer later wrote, "Their mercy was the most terrifying thing of all. We could not understand it, and we could not fight it." What began as a war of bullets became a war of beliefs. And on the battlefield of morality, the Americans were quietly winning. By 1944, this quiet war of values was reshaping the perception of both sides. But its most dramatic expressions were still to come, in the moments when mercy and death would meet face to face on the shattered slopes of Saipan. The battlefield can harden or humanize a man. And in the Pacific, both transformations occurred within the same tent. For the Americans, saving a Japanese life was not merely medical duty. It was a small rebellion against the brutality surrounding them. Many Marines had seen comrades tortured or mutilated after capture. The instinct for revenge was strong, yet inside the hospital perimeter, that rage had to be suspended. The Red Cross flag demanded restraint. It was a space where war paused and morality resumed. For Japanese prisoners, this mercy was devastating. Many had expected execution. Some begged to be left to die, refusing morphine, pleading with medics not to waste resources. Others wept silently, overcome by the shame of being treated by their enemies. The emotional dissonance was unbearable. They had been taught to see Americans as demons. Now, those demons were saving their lives with gentle hands. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division took careful note. Reports described a profound moral confusion among captured Japanese officers. Acts of compassion, it turned out, could fracture fanaticism more effectively than interrogation. Some prisoners began to question their own training, whispering among themselves that perhaps the Emperor's war was not divine after all. Compassion became an unexpected psychological weapon, one that attacked not the body, but the mind. Inside the field hospitals of Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima, medicine itself became an act of courage. Conditions were primitive. Tents leaked under tropical rain. Instruments were sterilized in boiling water. The air smelled of iodine and sweat. Blood transfusions were performed under fire, and the wounded often arrived faster than they could be treated. Yet, amid the chaos, American doctors upheld one unbroken rule. Every wounded man would receive the same standard of care. Surgeons worked 18-hour shifts, alternating between Marines, Seabees, and Japanese prisoners. They transfused blood plasma from American donors into Japanese veins. They amputated shattered limbs, dressed burns, and whispered words of comfort through translators. One account from a Navy surgeon described a moment when a Japanese officer, losing consciousness, tried to salute him. The doctor caught the man's hand mid-air and pressed it down gently, not as a gesture of dominance, but of humanity. That story spread among the camp and became legend. The equipment itself told its own story of values. American medics carried portable X-ray units, morphine injectors, and plasma kits, revolutionary tools in 1944. Japanese medicine, crippled by supply shortages and doctrine, often relied on herbal poultices and minimal anesthetics. To see this level of medical precision used on their own wounded was, to Japanese observers, as humbling as it was enlightening. In those canvas hospitals, technology and empathy fused, science serving morality. War tests not only armies, but civilizations. To the Imperial Japanese Command, mercy was irrelevant to victory. To the United States, mercy was victory. Treating the enemy's wounded was more than compliance with international law. It was a demonstration of moral identity. It proved that even in war, America's power came not just from its weapons, but from its conscience. Commanders like General Holland M. Smith and Admiral Chester Nimitz supported medical neutrality as a cornerstone of honor. They understood that the Red Cross, flying over every field tent, symbolized something larger than the battlefield. It symbolized belief in the value of life itself. For the Japanese, this was incomprehensible. How could an enemy show compassion and still fight with such ferocity? How could a soldier heal one day and kill the next? The contradiction was terrifying because it revealed a strength beyond discipline, a moral stability that fanaticism could never produce. In the end, the field hospitals of the Pacific became silent sermons. They preached that civilization was not measured by who conquered more land, but by who protected more life. As the war dragged into its final year, that lesson would reach its most powerful expression in a moment when captured Japanese officers watched Americans risk death not to kill, but to save. And on the slopes of Saipan, that moment came, June 26, 1944. The Battle of Saipan was nearing its dreadful end. The island's ridges smoked from constant shelling. The stench of death hung over the shattered terrain. American forces had cornered the remaining Japanese troops at the island's northern cliffs, a place the locals would forever call Suicide Point. In the chaos, U.S. medics moved through the carnage, searching for any signs of life. Shells still fell, snipers still fired, but the corpsmen kept going, crouched low, red crosses stitched to their sleeves, shouting for wounded in both English and broken Japanese. They found them in the caves, men burned, bleeding, half-buried. Some tried to fight even as they died. Others clutched grenades, ready to pull the pin at the sound of foreign footsteps. But what the Japanese hadn't expected was that the Americans didn't come to finish the job. They came to help. Inside one cave, a Marine corpsman named Harold Schultz crawled toward a faint groan. He found a Japanese soldier with a shattered leg and shrapnel through his shoulder. Schultz gave him morphine, wrapped his wounds, and dragged him out under fire. Minutes later, both men were carried to an American aid station, one as savior, the other as patient. Nearby, a group of captured Japanese officers stood under guard. They had been brought to witness the battlefield, partly for intelligence, partly for psychological observation. What they saw in that moment would haunt them forever. In the field hospital, American doctors worked on the Japanese soldier without hesitation. Blood plasma from a U.S. donor flowed through his veins. A nurse wiped his forehead with the same care she gave to her own countrymen. No distinction, no contempt, just medicine and mercy. The officers stared in stunned silence. One whispered to another, "Why are they saving him? He is our enemy." The reply came not from an American, but from a fellow prisoner, a captured Japanese doctor, who muttered, "Because they are American." For those officers, that single scene shattered years of indoctrination. They had been taught that compassion was weakness, that the enemy was inhuman. Yet here was the undeniable proof. The very men who had destroyed their defenses were now fighting to preserve their soldiers' lives. Outside, the guns still roared, but inside the tent, there was only the hum of machines and the rhythmic breath of men defying hate. That moment, brief unrecorded in official reports, but remembered in countless testimonies, became one of the Pacific War's quiet turning points. It was not a battle won with bullets, but a victory of conscience. For the Japanese observers, it was worse than defeat. It was revelation. They had seen an empire ruled by mercy. When the battle finally ended on July 9, 1944, Saipan was silent except for the cries of the wounded and the rustle of the wind through the palm trees. Tens of thousands were dead, soldiers, civilians, and families who had leapt from the cliffs rather than surrender. For the Japanese command, it was the ultimate tragedy. Defeat by a foe they had been taught to despise, and mercy from a foe they had been taught to fear. In the aftermath, American medical teams moved systematically across the island, converting bombed-out schools, churches, and bunkers into temporary hospitals. Hundreds of wounded Japanese were discovered, some barely alive, some pretending to be dead. All were treated. Among them was Captain Shigeo Okada, an intelligence officer found unconscious beside a machine gun nest. When he awoke, he realized he was inside an American hospital tent. He tried to end his life with a hidden razor fragment, but the nurse caught his wrist and stopped him. Later, when interviewed, Okada said quietly, "I believed Americans would kill me. Instead, they saved me." That was the day I began to doubt everything I knew. Stories like his multiplied. One American surgeon recorded performing over 40 operations on Japanese soldiers in a single week after Saipan. He noted that his team made no difference between uniform. Their only concern was survival. Many of those men, once healed, helped care for their own comrades under American supervision. For the first time, enemies worked side by side, not by command, but by necessity. The Japanese officers who survived Saipan were eventually transported to prisoner compounds on Guam and Hawaii. There, interrogators noted a recurring theme in their testimonies: disbelief. Some said they were haunted by what they had witnessed, not the bombs or the defeat, but the compassion. They struggled to explain it within the moral logic of Bushido. In one report filed in late 1944, an American intelligence officer wrote, "Captured Japanese officers exhibit greater shock from humane treatment than from combat losses. Their worldview cannot account for mercy from an enemy." This was the true psychological victory of Saipan, a quiet revolution inside the minds of the defeated. Mercy had achieved what force alone never could. It had dismantled the spiritual foundation of the enemy's cause. The American medics themselves rarely spoke of it as heroism. Many refused medals, saying they were simply following orders, healing whoever came through the flap of the tent. But to the Japanese, those acts were incomprehensible and unforgettable. In later years, a Japanese medical officer who survived Saipan wrote a memoir titled Under the Red Cross Flag. In it, he described the moment he watched an American nurse close the eyes of a dying Japanese soldier, whispering a prayer she did not know he could hear. He ended his memoir with a single line: "That was when I understood why we lost." For the United States, Saipan was a stepping stone toward Japan, strategically vital for the next phase of the Pacific War. But beneath that military triumph lay another, quieter conquest of morality over fanaticism, of humanity over hate. The field hospital of Saipan didn't just save bodies, they healed something deeper: the belief that compassion could survive even inside hell. When the war finally ended in August 1945, with the surrender of Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the guns fell silent, but the memories did not. Across the Pacific, hundreds of Japanese officers and soldiers who had survived captivity carried with them a strange and conflicting image of their former enemy. They had been raised to believe that mercy was weakness, yet they had been kept alive by it. For the Americans, the experience of treating enemy wounded had also left deep marks. Field surgeons who had performed life-saving operations on Japanese soldiers wrote in their journals that the duty to heal had kept them sane amid chaos. "If I had stopped caring for human life," one Navy doctor wrote, "I would have become what we were fighting against." The American hospitals in the Pacific remained operational for months after the ceasefire. Wounded Japanese soldiers, some still refusing to speak or eat, were nursed back to health and later repatriated under the supervision of the International Committee of the Red Cross. By early 1946, thousands had been returned home from Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii, often in better condition than when they had first been captured. Their homecoming, however, was fraught with shame. In Japan, surrender still carried a stigma. Many returning soldiers concealed their captivity, afraid of being branded cowards. Yet among them circulated stories that defied wartime propaganda. Men spoke in whispers of the American doctors who had treated them, the nurses who had risked their lives to save them, the medics who had shared their rations even when supplies ran low. One former officer, Captain Okada, the same man saved on Saipan, became a quiet advocate for change. In post-war Japan, he lectured at military academies about the ethics of war and medicine, telling cadets that true honor is not in dying bravely, but in saving life bravely. His views were controversial, but they resonated with a generation emerging from defeat and moral exhaustion. For the Americans, too, the memory of Saipan endured. In veteran reunions decades later, medics often spoke less about the battles they fought and more about the lives they saved, even those wearing the wrong uniform. One Marine corpsman remembered carrying a wounded Japanese boy, barely 17 years old. He kept saying something over and over. Later, they told me it meant mother. The field hospitals had done more than heal. They had preserved a sense of humanity that could easily have vanished in the Pacific's brutality. In a war marked by atrocities on both sides, those tents stood as fragile sanctuaries of conscience. In the reports of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, the entries were brief and clinical. Enemy wounded, treated per Geneva Convention. But behind those words were stories of courage, empathy, and quiet defiance of hatred. For both nations, the war in the Pacific had ended with devastation. Yet, out of that destruction rose something rare: respect. Respect born not from surrender, but from mercy. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the echoes of those field hospitals reached far beyond the Pacific. The compassion shown by American medics had planted seeds of reflection inside a defeated nation. When Japan began rebuilding its society, those seeds would quietly take root. Among the post-war generation of doctors, nurses, and military reformers, many drew inspiration from the medical ethics they had witnessed or heard about in captivity. The Japanese Red Cross Society, reorganized under Allied supervision, incorporated Western humanitarian standards for the first time. Medical schools began teaching universal care, the idea that a patient's worth was not measured by nationality, class, or allegiance. Some of the men who had once fought on Saipan or Iwo Jima later became leaders in Japan's medical modernization. They cited their experiences of American mercy as a turning point in their understanding of honor. A former Imperial Army surgeon wrote in a 1951 journal, "We learned too late that the preservation of life is the truest duty of a soldier." For the Americans, those lessons were no less lasting. The Pacific Campaign had hardened a generation, but the field hospitals reminded them that victory meant nothing if it cost one's humanity. When the U.S. Army Medical Department reviewed wartime conduct, the Pacific operations were cited as proof that compassion was not a liability, but a strength. The treatment of Japanese wounded became a cornerstone example in post-war military ethics training, evidence that moral order could endure even in total war. By the 1960s, as the United States and Japan became allies, reconciliation efforts began quietly taking shape. Former enemies met again, this time as doctors, diplomats, and researchers. A few American medics traveled to Japan, visiting hospitals and universities. Some were astonished to meet their former patients, now gray-haired men who greeted them with bows and gratitude. In 1972, during a symposium on wartime medical ethics held in Tokyo, one elderly Japanese doctor stood before a mixed audience of Americans and Japanese and said simply, "On Saipan, I saw a nation strong enough to save its enemies. That is when I understood that compassion is a kind of victory." That single statement encapsulated the transformation of two civilizations once separated by hate. Today, few traces of those field hospitals remain, only scattered artifacts, faded photographs, and a handful of memoirs written by men who remembered the smell of iodine and the sound of American nurses calling for more bandages. Yet their moral legacy endures. The story of Saipan's medical tents became more than a wartime anecdote. It became a measure of what humanity can preserve, even in its darkest hour. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of self-examination. For the Americans, it reaffirmed that the power to heal could be as mighty as the power to destroy. And for history, it left a truth that still resonates, that mercy, once shown, never truly fades. It becomes part of who we are. War often reveals the worst in mankind: cruelty, vengeance, and fear given form. But sometimes, within its wreckage, it exposes something greater: the resilience of conscience. On the islands of the Pacific, among the burning jungles and shattered cliffs, the field hospitals of the United States did more than mend broken bodies. They mended the idea of humanity itself. In the midst of a war that devoured compassion, American medics refused to surrender theirs. To the Japanese, this mercy was incomprehensible. To the Americans, it was duty. Yet, in that simple choice, to heal rather than to hate, the U.S. revealed the quiet strength of its civilization. It proved that moral courage could exist beside military power, that victory was hollow unless it preserved the very values it claimed to defend. The Japanese officers, who once stood horrified at the sight of Americans treating their wounded, would later carry that image for the rest of their lives. In it, they saw the collapse of everything they had believed about honor and shame. But they also saw something new, a glimpse of peace built not on surrender, but on empathy. Decades later, when those same men told their children about the war, many skipped the battles and spoke, instead of a strange moment on a tropical island, a tent marked with a red cross, and an enemy who saved their lives. That image became their quiet absolution and history's quiet lesson. Because in a century defined by destruction, a few men chose to heal, and in doing so, they proved a truth that outlasted every empire and every war. Mercy is not weakness. It is victory.